Lesson 28, Adding API Security. Lesson you apply a few security to your API out. Without a browser to store cookies, some external applications may find it difficult to use your API without a way to verify the user's identity. First, implement some basic security by providing an API token that must be appended to each request. Then improve the strategy by generating a unique API key for each user upon account creation. Lastly, explore JSON Web Tokens, a system of hashing user data and exchanging tokens to authenticate user accounts without a browser. This lesson covers adding security token verification middleware, creating a pre-save hook to generate API keys, implementing JSON Web Tokens head authentication, implementing simple security. Unit 5 guided you through user account creation and authentication. With the help of a few packages, you created a thorough process of validating and encrypting user data and of ensuring that those were authenticated before getting access to certain pages. Even with the help of external packages, you can take some simple steps to protect your API. The first method you will use in this lesson is generating an API token that must be used by users accessing your API. Users need to have a token because they may not be using a browser to access the API. So your current implementation with JS, cookies and sessions may not work with the client. An additional token reduces this risk, ensuring that only users who make requests with a valid token can see data. You could add app.setToken to main.js, for example. Then this application variable would be set to whatever you use as the token environment variable, or default to recipe token. Where function verified token checks for a query param called API token that matches the token you said earlier. The token match, call next to continue the middleware chain. Otherwise, pass an error with the custom message. The error reaches your error handler middleware and displays the message JSON. Using 28.1, adding middleware function to verify API token in users controller.js. So verify token is a middleware function, and it has request, response, and next as parameters. Request, and then with the request query API token, it is used to access the value of the API. What it would do is it will check the API token. It will check if the API token is the same as our prescribed token, which is a recipe token. If that API token is recipe token and it matches with our prescribed token, it will call next and take it to the next middleware function. If they are not matching, it will call the next with the error invalid API token. Adding API tokens. You just construct the middleware function to verify query parameters in the URL. This method is effective at securing your API, but it doesn't prevent non-users from putting their hands on the one and only token. To improve the system, add a custom token to each user account. Do this by adding a new API token field to the user schema that's type of string. Next, build a pre-save hook on the user model to generate an API token that's unique to the user upon account creation. Before you get to the code, use Node.js package to help with token generation. Run token package provides some simple tools for creating new alphanumeric tokens of your desired length. Run npm install run token to install the run token package in this project and require it in user.js. The next listing to user.js. This code first checks whether the user's API field is set. If it isn't generating you unique 16-character token with run token generate. Creating a pre-save hook generate an API token in user.js. So the user schema is our user model. So this is our user model. And then with our pre-save, what our pre-save does is it executes the function. It will execute the function before saving the user. So basically, it will generate an API token before saving the user. So in this middle way, this refers to the current user instance being created or being saved. So this refers to the current to the user that we are about to save. And then the function checks if the API is set. If the API token is not set, so if the user doesn't have an API token, it will generate an API token for the user with a length of 16. And then after the API token is created, it will be assigned to the user's API token property. So it will be assigned to the user's API token. So basically, before we save the new user, we check if they have an API token, and if they do not have an API token, we generate the API token for them using run token.generate. And then after the token has been generated, we call next to save the new user. To use this token, you need to modify the verified token metadata to check the API token query param against the tokens in your database. Change verified token in API /users controller.js code listing in 28.3. In this modified middleware function, you grab the token as the query parameter. If a token appears in the URL, search the user's database for a single user who has that API token. If such a user exists, continue to the next middleware function. If no user with that token exists, if an error occurs in the query or if no query parameter was used, an error. Listing 28.3, improving the token verification action in user controller.js. So our verification token takes request, response, and next as parameters, and then it will extract the API token from request query. So we let and then that what do you call that API token will be saved in token. And then if an API token is provided, if the token is provided, it proceeds to the database query and finds a user, and it will find that user that has that exact API token. And then when the user is found, When that user with the specific API is found, it calls the next middleware function. And then if there's no user with the provided middleware function, it calls the next error. It will call the next error, which is the next error will be new error, invalid API token. And then if there's an error during the query, it will also catch the error. It will catch the error and call the next function, which is the error object, where it will also say invalid API token. So the entire verification process is, it will check if it will extract an API token and then save it in token, and then it will take that token and query it and try and find a user that has that specific generated token. If there is a user, it will move to the next middleware function. If there's no user, it will say it will provide an error, invalid API token. And then if there's an error in the query process, it will provide the same error, invalid API token. .8.3 using JSON Web Tokens. You can build a secure API by using cookies, but the API's functionality still depends on its clients to support and store those cookies. Consider someone who writes a script to run requests against the API solely from the terminal window, for example. In this case, if you want to apply user authentication on incoming requests, you need some way to keep track of which users are requesting and whether they've recently logged in. Without a visual login page, that task can be difficult. You can try some alternative solutions, one of which is using JSON Web Tickets. JSON Web Tokens are signed or encrypted data passed between the server and client as a means of representing an authenticated user request. Ultimately, JSON Web Tokens are like sessions in a different format and used differently in web communication. You can think of JWTs as being like API tokens that are regenerated on every login. JWTs contain three parts as defined in Table 2.1. They have a header, which is a JSON object detailing how the data in the JWT is prepared and hashed. The payload is the data stored in the JWT used to verify the user who previously authenticated. The payload normally includes the user's ID, and then it has a signature, which is a hashed code using the header and payload values. In this section, you apply JWT API security with the help of the JSON Web Token package. Install the JSON Web Token package by running npm install JSON Web Token in terminal. Because you're going to use JWTs for user verification in the API, require JSON Web Tokens in user's controller. This action uses the passport.local strategy that you set up in lesson 24. Through the authenticate method, verify that the user email address and password match that of a user in the database. Then through a callback function, if a user is found with the matching email and password, use JSON Web Token.sign to create a token with the user's ID and an expiration date, so that set to 1 day from the time of signing. Finally, respond with a JSON object with a success tag and the signed token. Otherwise, respond with the error message. Listening to 8.4, creating a login action for the API and users controller. So our API authenticate has request response and next as parameters, and it is used to authenticate. So our API authenticate is used to authenticate users using the local strategy of of Passport. What happens is it calls passport.authenticate to trigger the authentication process, and then it does that by using the local strategy, where the Passport local strategy checks the email and password of the user. This happens in the first callback function, and then in our second callback function, we receive user and error as parameters. So our second callback function is executed after the authentication takes place. And then if the authentication of the user, if the authentication is successful, the user parameter, so if we are successful in the authentication, the user parameter will have our user object, and then a JSON web ticket. A JSON web ticket is created using the JSON web token.sign. And then the JSON web ticket will contains the data field, and then it saves the user ID, and then it will have that expiration date where the token will expire in 1 day. So this is an example for a successful JSON web ticket authentication in the terminal. So it will have success true, it will have success true, and the JSON web ticket. And then if the authentication didn't happen, it will respond with success false, and then with the error message could not authenticate the user. To secure all the API endpoints, add an action to verify incoming JWTs and add that middleware for every API route. Add the code in listing 28.6 to userscontroller.js. First, pull the incoming token from the request header. Then, if a token exists, use json.webticket.verify along with the token and secret password phrase to decode the token and verify its authenticity. The following callback provides any errors that may have occurred, as well as the decoded payload. You can check whether the payload has a value. If so, pull the user's ID from payload data and query the database for a user with that ID. So creating a verification action for the API in usercontroller.js. So our verify JWT has request and response and next as parameters. So it starts by extracting the token from the request header. So it extracts the token from the request headers and saves it in token. And then if the token exists, it verifies the token using so it verifies that specific token using JSON.token.verify. And then what it will do is it will check that token against the secret encoding passphrase to basically authenticate after it decodes the token. And then if the payload verification, so basically if the verification is available or the payload is available, it extracts payload data, where payload data is the user ID, which is the user ID, and then it will take that user ID and try and find that user in our data in our database. And then if that user is if that specific user that has that payload is found, it calls next. It will call next to continue with the request and response. And then if that specific user is not found so if that user ID is not found in the database, it will respond with an error status code forbidden, and then it will provide the message no user account found. So it would mean that no such user is found. And then if that user is not available, or that user cannot be authenticated, it will provide the message, the error unauthorized, and the message cannot verify API token. And then if no token also is provided in the request header, so if the token is not provided in our response headers, it will respond with also an unauthorized, and then with the message provide token. So in this lesson, you learn how to implement 3 security tokens on your API. The first strategy is a simple security token that can be used by all clients. The second strategy requires generating a new random token for each user upon creation. In the third approach, you use JWTs to provide the most secure option for authenticating users to access your API. In lesson 2019, you have an opportunity to build an API with some of the functionality introduced in this unit.